You don't have to look very far into Ukraine's history to figure out why they are so vehemently against being controlled by the Russians and why many of them indeed hate the Russians. This place where I'm standing is called Bykivnia. It's a village outside of Kyiv, on the outskirts near Brovary. This wall behind me is a memorial with 22,000 names on it that is really only about 10% of the human beings who were murdered by the Soviet state and dumped right here where I'm standing. They had a massive mass grave, actually hundreds of them, in this pine forest just right off the road. And from the 1920s till about 1950, the Soviets used this place as a dumping ground for the bodies of the citizens that they murdered in their various pogroms and during the Great Terror of the 1930s under Stalin and other massacres that were that took place. This whole wall behind me is from one massacre that took place of Polish officers, military officers and intelligentsia and things like that who were killed once the Soviet Union took over Poland during World War II. Much of this area was just, like I say, they would ship people in here on train cars, bodies stacked like cordwood, and then they would dump them in massive holes that were dug out here in this pine forest. And now there is a memorial here that obviously has a lot of money and time and effort put into it. They've had Ukrainian and other archaeologists who have come out here and have actually exhumed many of the bodies. They've searched through old Soviet records and have found, look at that giant hill back there, they've found the names of many of the people who were killed and dumped and buried here. And then they built this monument that's a mile off the road, out in the middle of the forest, and essentially nobody ever comes here. I mean, unless you had family that was murdered here, why would you ever come here? This is not a tourist site. I would venture to say that nobody listening to this podcast has ever heard of Bykivnia, but yet 200,000 souls were entombed here in piles of mass graves by the Soviet Union. And it's strangely and eerily reminiscent of the massacres that we've seen in places around Ukraine, in Mariupol, in Irpin and Bucha. They just a week ago found 7 more bodies in a hastily dug hole in Bucha that were all all shot in the back of the head. They were shot in the kneecaps, had their hands tied behind their back. They were obviously tortured and murdered by the Russian troops who were out here. If the Soviet Union was so brutal that they perpetrated the Holodomor, they perpetrated that starvation of 4 million people during 1932 and 1933, simply because they decided that they had to collect a certain amount of grain, and so conditions on the ground didn't matter. If there was a drought that year and they didn't have that much grain, they just said, well, it must be somebody's fault, and so they just started literally taking every scrap of food from millions of Ukrainians and watching them starve to death. It was an orchestrated genocide against the Ukrainian people by the Russian people who were in charge of the Soviet Union, by Stalin and his people. Then they moved a bunch of Russians into Ukraine to take over those fields because there was nobody alive left to work those fields the next year. And so that's why there are so many Russians in the southeast of Ukraine today, because they replaced the Ukrainians that they murdered with Russians from all over the place. They also moved kulaks, the middle class Ukrainian peasants. They moved hundreds of thousands of them to Siberia and all over the place and took them out of, basically sent them off to the Gulag. And many of them died on the way or in the process. So there are sites like this. I mean, this should be the kind of thing that kids learn about in school in the United States, because the divisions that are caused by class warfare, socialism, is at its heart class warfare. Because if everybody isn't poor, then the people who, for whatever reason, are not poor, they're evil people. You see that being fomented in the United States today. And there's a warning here at Bikyvnia. If you think that people today would not hesitate to murder 200,000 people because of the color of their skin, because of their socioeconomic status, because of where they live or where they were born or how they worship or whatever, you got another thing coming. It's not white supremacy. These were white people killing other white people. And we see the same thing all over the world. We are this close to absolute anarchy, to barbarity that we can't even imagine. There's a thin veneer of civility over human civilization. And when you have groups of people who are actively tearing that civility down, actively encouraging that civility to go away, encouraging people to attack others, those people are bad. Well, this is the end result. Hundreds of thousands of people dumped in a hole in a pine forest in the middle of nowhere that nobody will ever remember. Keep that in mind. I'm Chuck Holton. Thanks for watching Hot Zone.
Footage from the Ukrainian military appears to show multiple attacks half a mile down the road. As a Russian column was hit, a voice says, "We were ambushed. The commander was killed."
This is the village of Brovary, just north of Kyiv, on the main highway that goes into the capital. Back in March, this is the closest that the Russians got to actually breaching the capital city. And they were ambushed by Ukrainian forces who took out almost an entire tank battalion in that engagement. These are some of those tanks and armored vehicles behind me. And this is all that's left. It's now a memorial and a reminder to the Ukrainians about the resilience of their people and their determination not to allow the Russians to take over their country.